so my presentation is somehow linked to the previous one because it will zoom in to a specific area, which is consumer credit and debt in the digital environment. And what I will do is provide you with an EU perspective. So in the recent times, there has been an exponential increase of digital and financial products. And therefore, we have seen that the consumer credit sector has been profoundly transformed by the digital transition. And as a result, we can see new lenders, for instance, peer-to-peer lending platforms that have emerged, and also traditional financial providers offer credits online more and more. And what is interesting is that these new innovative lending platforms often use new types of technology to assess the creditworthiness of consumers before they grant a credit. And this raises questions in terms of consumer protection, but also in terms of data protection. And as a result of these developments, we can see that consumers have become more vulnerable. They are financially vulnerable, and there's also an increase of digital vulnerability. In my presentation, I will look at some of these topics, and it is divided in 5 parts. So first, I will provide a brief overview of the context and explain the advantages as well as the disadvantages of digitalization of consumer credit. And then I will briefly touch upon those new crowd lending platforms and what this means for consumers, and the use of those companies of artificial intelligence and big data to assess creditworthiness. And then finally, I will look at the credit regulation that exists in the EU and make some suggestions for reform, because it's actually quite outdated and needs to be adapted to this digital change in the credit sector. So let me now first start with providing a little bit of context and explain the benefits and risks with regard to digitalization of consumer credit. So on one hand, this development has huge benefits for consumers because they have now easier access to information. They can go online and compare products before agreeing to a contract. In addition, consumers also have more choice and funding options, and this is enhanced through this digital offer and those peer-to-peer lending platforms. And finally, there's also faster and easier access to credit. So these are all advantages because obviously access to credits provide consumers with a greater buying power, and they can also invest into the future. However, there are also some downsides and serious risks, which is first of all that now in this fast-paced environment, there is less time for reflection for consumers, and that means that they might take the wrong choice. And also with this development of new products, the different credit options are more complex and difficult to assess. And this is specifically problematic in the financial sector because credit can have a really long-term impact on consumers. For instance, if we look at mortgages, they can, the contracts can have a duration of 20 years or so, and therefore the wrong decision can decrease the wellness of consumers in the long term. And then finally, we also see that the regulators don't manage to keep up with this fast-paced development, and therefore there are some regulatory gaps if I look now specifically at the EU level. And overall, we can see that consumers have become more vulnerable. And there are several reasons for this. On one hand, there is an increase of aggressive online selling practices and advertisements, and this can lead to high-cost short-term credit that is really expensive for consumers and might enhance over-indebtedness. And what we also see from recent reports is that credit is often granted without checking affordability. And that means that consumers access credits that they cannot pay back. And indeed, if we look at the new statistics, we see that many countries are witnessing a marked increase of private debt. According to new reports, there is a 10 to 33% of EU households who have arrears in mortgages, in rent or loans. And therefore, there is a high risk of over-indebtedness, and this has negative consequences, can lead to evictions and also to social exclusion. If we look at the recent case law in the EU, we can see there has been a growing number of individuals since the crisis, the financial crisis, that encountered difficulties in repaying their debts and therefore risk losing their home. And as a result, there have been many court cases on unfair contractual terms in credit contracts. So there is a real challenge here with regard to debt and unfair contractual terms. And if we look at recent debates, for instance, in the literature, we can see that famous scholars such as Ramsey and Ferretti have highlighted that actually the current credit regulation frameworks that exist, so there are some existing laws that have been implemented in the EU, they are not effective enough, and there is a need for an update. And therefore, the European Commission is currently assessing how to improve the legal framework to make it fit for these new developments and in order to tackle household debt. And there are two key questions that are particularly relevant. First of all, to what extent can the EU law cater for peer-to-peer lending and digitalization, and how to ensure fairness and tackle over-indebtedness in the digital environment? Now, in order to find an answer, first it's important to understand this increase, for instance, of crowd lending platforms. And this is a digital business model that has become quite important in providing credit for consumers, and it connects those who can lend money to those who need financing. And the investors co-finance projects by lending money to the consumer in return for payment of interest. And the process is quite straightforward. So we can see here that what happens is that the borrower would make an application to the crowdlending platform, and then the crowdlending platform puts the borrower in touch with the private lenders or the institutional lenders. And then if the credit assessment is positive, then the consumer will enter into a contract for this credit agreement. What is really specific about this process is that the entire process is handled by the crowdlending platform. So without really much contact between the consumer and the creditor in exchange for a fee. And what is also worth mentioning is that these new types of lenders, they use an alternative approach to creditworthiness assessment. Now, the creditworthiness assessment is really key and has been included in the EU Consumer Credit Regulation in Article 8, the Consumer Credit Directive, that requires creditors to assess the consumer creditworthiness and use sufficient information from the consumer in order to do this assessment. However, a problem with this is that it's a really vague kind of requirement. And also the court has left a lot of leeway to the creditors. So that means that the creditor has a broad margin of discretion in the determination of the information that they need to use. And as a result, this requirement to assess creditworthiness is not really working effectively. And the key objective, which is to avoid over-indebtedness, therefore is not met sufficiently. And therefore, there might be here a need for reform, as I will show later. And what is also interesting to mention is that there's these new providers, those peer-to-peer lending platforms, they apply big data and analytics as a substitute for classic assessment tools and standards of bank credit analysis. And they use a really wide range of data. For instance, that could be the type of shopping consumers make, internet browsing, social media, and other online trails to mathematically then determine the credit risk of consumers. And this also raises question if this way of assessment, first of all, is effective and if it's a fair way of proceeding, and how compliant is this approach with data protection. Now, in order to understand how the EU tried to tackle consumer vulnerability, we have to look specifically at the Consumer Credit Directive. And this is a directive that was already introduced in 2008, so it's actually quite an old legislative act, and it had two key objectives. First, to promote a single credit market through legal harmonization, and also to provide a high level of consumer protection. And what is important to highlight here is that it only has quite a narrow application. And this is something that has been criticized and as problematic, because it only applies to credit agreements ranging from 200 to 75,000 euros. And it excludes quite a lot of other credit agreements, such as mortgages and overdraft facilities. And the problem is that for those consumers who enter into a different type of credit agreements, there might not be sufficient protection, because they would then be excluded from this protection provided by the credit agreement. So there is a need to broaden the scope in order to tackle over-indebtedness. And what is special about this directive is that it has a really strong focus on disclosure. That means that the directive requires that the consumer receive detailed information at an early stage of the contract. So already at the advertising stage and at the pre-contractual stage, consumers are provided with information. And the idea is to render the consumer aware of the total cost, risk, to enable an informed decision. And there are two key points that are worth mentioning. First of all, this directive includes some consumer rights. And here the most important one I would like to highlight is the right to withdrawal from the credit agreement within 14 days. And that's particularly useful also in the digital environment, because as I highlighted before, there is this fast-paced developed environment where consumers take decisions quite quickly without sufficient time to consider if this credit agreement is really the right choice in the longer term. And so this 14 days cooling off period, as it's called, allows the consumer to reconsider and withdraw from the agreement without costs and so on. So it can avoid negative impact if the consumer enters into agreement without sufficient consideration, if this is the right approach. And the second point that is really important and has been described as the most innovative part of the directive in 2008 was the principle of responsible credit or lending. And that contained two main parts. First of all, an obligation of the financial provider to advise the consumer so that the consumer has a better idea what is the suitable credit in the specific circumstance. And that's really useful indeed because of the complexity of the credit options. And then second, an obligation to assess creditworthiness of the consumer to avoid over-indebtedness. These are really important obligations. However, in practice, what we can see is that it didn't work sufficiently well. Why? Because on one hand, there are no specific sanctions mentioned in the directive if the creditor doesn't comply with these obligations. And in addition, there is a lack of criteria that need to be fulfilled in this creditworthiness assessment. And therefore, it's not really precise enough to prevent over-indebtedness and to make this creditworthiness assessment useful. And if we look at the Consumer Credit Directive more generally, there has also, as we see, the approach that has been taken is mainly to focus on consumer information. And in a way, what practice has shown is that this approach is too one-sided because the debtor is seen as a rational decision maker by the Commission or by the EU, while in reality, empirical evidence and behavioral economics have shown that actually individuals are not always able to take rational decisions, and therefore they're often manipulated by advertising and take decisions that are not suitable. And vulnerable groups such as the elderly, the young, or the uneducated are particularly affected by this. And therefore, there is a strong opinion for instance, in the literature that there should be a stronger focus actually on quality of information rather than quantity in order to avoid information overloads. And now I'm coming to my last point, which is the question, how does this legal framework deal with those new types of lenders, the crowdfunding lenders and the P2P lending? And what is interesting to mention is that the credit regulation sees those lending platforms as credit intermediaries. That means that they have certain obligations, they have to inform the consumers, but it does not provide a clear duty to assess the creditworthiness for those platforms. And that's problematic because, as I showed before, the platforms usually are the only link between consumers and creditors, and therefore there would be a need to include those new providers of credit, those platforms, in this credit regulation framework to ensure that they do apply an effective creditworthiness assessment, and that might then help to avoid over-indebtedness in the future. So I'm coming now to my conclusion, and this also contains somehow some suggestions how this regulatory framework could be improved and updated. And there are three key points to this. First, there is a need for a better adaptation to this digital innovation. Second, there is a need to create a framework that really ensures that responsible lending is effective. And then finally, and crucially, there is a need for debt solution procedures. And first of all, what is important here is first to provide a broader coverage of the Consumer Credit Act, for instance, to include also regulation for those peer-to-peer lending platforms. Second, it's crucial that there is some clarification how this creditworthiness assessment should be performed to make it effective. And then there's a great need also to improve digital as well as financial literacy for consumers through education programs and advertisement. And another element that hasn't been included and has been recommended by the international guidelines that were mentioned previously by Ms. Melville, for instance, by the World Bank and the OECD, as well as the UN, it's essential to include principles of fair treatment and good conduct by financial providers. And it's something that is unfortunately missing in the consumer credit regulation, in the consumer credit directive that I mentioned before. And then finally, for those consumers that are highly indebted and in a vicious circle, and therefore for those ones where it's really difficult to get out of this, it is important to provide debt advice services and also to provide them with personal insolvency procedures that can help them to get out of this vicious circle, and so they can integrate again into society and into the economy. And that brings me to the end of this presentation. Thanks very much for your attention. I'm happy to reply to any questions.